Since the late 1960s, Sylvia Plimack Mangold's career has been one of quiet subversion. A 50-year period of slowly looking up from the floor to the horizon. And now, craning her neck to the treetops. Her subject matter has gone no further than her own backyard. Her practice could appear to be deeply insular. But as curator Helen Molesworth's 2008 group show Solitaire demonstrated, Mangold's also maintained an ambivalent but definite relationship with the wider discourse of her time, running parallel to, but at a certain remove from the art world around her, of her time, while never being tied to it. She's never looked particularly dated. She works in her own continuum. Her earliest mature paintings from the 60s and 70s anticipate the flattened perspectives and revive trompe l'oeil techniques in the work of contemporary artist Lucy Mackenzie, for example. Yet, today, she's making nature studies in the grand tradition and referencing Lovis Corinth of all people. Objective yet highly personal. Formally and conceptually rigorous yet playful, witty. Mangold's paintings display a unique, poetic attention. A discreetly poetic attention, which is entirely her own. Mangold's earliest mature works depict the parquet floors of her home, literally starting from the ground up. The paintings explore the inherent paradox of representing a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface. They're heavily cropped, and they both emphasize and frustrate our sense of perspective, with their tiled lines leading nowhere or falling off the edge and hitting a wall. They implicitly deal with the frame, the rectangle, the grid, the monochrome, all of which are notions which fascinated minimalism. But they find these things in the complications of the everyday, the lived. They fully embrace their own nature as decorative panels, prepared surfaces, rejecting Donald Judd's 1965 assertion that the main thing wrong with painting is that it's a rectangular plane placed flat against the wall, which determines and limits the arrangement of whatever's inside of it. Mangold's paintings instead begin from this position. It's the first principle of her large and varied body of work. The floor paintings are extremely conscious of the viewer's position in relation to the work, yet another tenet of minimalism, but they're equally conscious of the viewer's fictive position towards the picture's illusionistic space, a space which Mangold obligingly helps the viewer to navigate. She wrote that she wanted to create a space that invited you in, and after a while escorted you out. The experience I want the viewer to have is to enter the painting and then come back to the surface, the actual material. I don't want the viewer to get stuck in there. Which brings us to Mangold's most consistent preoccupation: attention. How it might be held, directed, deflected, rewarded, extended, nurtured, but never demanded. Her floor-gazing painting is meditative. Attention is at once highly focused and yet unbirthed, drifting. Often there are metal rulers supplied as visual anchors, devices of orientation. Yet these measuring devices are also made functionally redundant. Their increments distorted by the picture's perspective. The manufacturer's name, exact, adds a further element of irony, but like so much of her work, there's a melancholy mixed in with the humour, a lived reality running alongside the perceptual philosophy. In Memory of My Father cuts off its ruler at 66 and a half, her father's lifespan at the time of his death. Realist in technique, yet verging on abstraction. The floor paintings do just enough to be images, but the floor is a quiet subject, a discreet subject for a painting. Around the time these paintings were being made, there was a renewed interest in a form of music that might be also described as discreet. As the continuing exchange of ideas between minimalism in music and the visual arts began to morph into something less abstract and more something related to the everyday. One of the first steps on this path was Robert Rauschenberg's white paintings of 1951, blank canvases intended to make the viewer aware of the subtly shifting conditions of the space in which they were hung. Composer John Cage later referred to them as airports for lights, shadows, and particles. Cage saw the white paintings as a challenge which music had to meet or risk lagging behind. 4 minutes 33 was his response. A 3-movement composition for any instrument or any combination of instruments. The piece is made up of entirely empty bars. Like Rauschenberg's blank canvases, it's a work which relies on the ambience of the environment in which it's staged, on the receptiveness of its audience. The maker simply establishes a framework, then quietly leaves the room. 4 minutes 33 was also partly a response to Erik Satie's writing in the previous century, that the modern world called for furniture music, a music that could blend in with the clatter of knives and forks at dinner, a music that wouldn't call attention to itself or its composer, but which might exist discreetly within the environment. By the early 1970s, this line of thinking mutated into what Brian Eno would later term ambient music. Just as Mangold took something of a cue from the tail end of minimalism in the visual arts, Eno would co-opt many techniques from the so-called minimalist composers working in the previous decade, pursuing generative systems and compositional techniques which would allow for some sonic variation through minimal authorial intervention, with the intention that a listener's attention be engaged with in a similarly oblique way. Eno wrote in the sleeve notes of his 1978 album, Ambient 1, Music for Airports. Ambient music is intended to induce calm and a space to think. It must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention without enforcing one in particular. It must be as ignorable as it is interesting. As with Mangold's approach to painting, Eno's approach to ambient music would bring certain hardline minimalist notions back into the realm of something more genuinely useful and pleasurable, something in its own quiet way emotive and expressive. Eno's main compositional technique during this period was a form of tape looping, a system in which multiple loops of magnetic recording tape are allowed to randomly configure or diverge harmonically, resulting in endlessly variable compositions depending only upon the introduction of really minimal changes in the speed or length of the tape. At about this time in the mid-1970s, Mangold's gaze would lift up and out the window into the surrounding landscape. As with the rulers in her floor paintings, she would include the masking tape used in their construction as part of the painted image. Now, masking tape and magnetic recording tape are obviously entirely different materials. However, it's significant that in each case, the tape, which is something usually seen as a functional tool, becomes both a compositional element in its own right and a tangible part of the physical work. Where, how much, and how cleanly applied the masking tape is has a big effect on the character of each painting. It can seem accidental or intentional, bluntly editorial or elegant. There's sometimes more and sometimes less of a visible landscape, just as the tape itself varies wildly in density and transparency. Often it complements or complicates the scene's sense of illumination or darkness, providing both a literal viewfinder and a kind of filter, letting various amounts of illusionistic paint and light bleed through. Above all, the masking tape brings with it a sense of process, sometimes methodical and measured, sometimes messy, but always in media res. There's a feeling of infinitely prolonged preparation, as if the configurations arrived at are entirely provisional. They are paintings partly about the activity of making, their own permanently coming into being. In many ways, they recall the slightly unstable rectangles of 1573, the last painting by Jeremy Moon, another 1970s maverick. It's a painting which has the same sense of materials gathered and ready. Despite its large size, it could be easily read as 4 coloured cards arranged on a tabletop. Like Mangold's tape pictures, it flips between abstraction and illusion, 2 and 3 dimensions. The colours vibrate at their edges just enough to suggest the slightest amount of depth, the slightest amount of light and air between each sheet. The angles are a little off 90 degrees, the L shapes noticeably thinning towards their ends. Like the tape pictures, it's as if the work hasn't quite settled. Even its sense of scale is unstable. Again, like the tape pictures, it's a large painting which can seem like a small preparatory study, a maquette that's been blown up out of all proportion. Both Mangold's tape paintings and Moon's shaped canvas have their roots in minimal abstraction, but they also lead all the way back to Chardin's 18th century portraits of children building playing card castles, sharing similar themes of chance and construction, play and precariousness. They are reflections on the brinkmanship of making the next move, on taking the rectangle for a walk. Mangold's masking tape paintings are also intimately linked to the quadlibe, a fairly despised subgenre of trompe l'oeil painting. Abstraction and assemblage, illusion and conceit are all part of the quadlibe, which flips still life's three-dimensionality back into something more emphatically flat, favouring objects like letters and clippings, ribbons and tacks. The best examples of the genre play with these contradictions, finding their own peculiar sense of poetry in the equivalences between the knickknacks arranged across the tabletop or pinboard, and the colours and shapes arranged across the picture surface. Though it in some ways anticipates the modern-day mood board, the quadlibe has never really been taken as anything more than a light-hearted diversion, an inoffensive novelty. So there's a certain joy in watching Mangold rummage around in it, adapting her own version of a type of painting you basically aren't supposed to like. And it's not just the artist being willfully perverse, deliberately selecting a minor subgenre with which to make serious art. As with every stage of Mangold's practice, it's a natural progression of her pictorial logic, and, crucially, it's an expansion of her painterly vocabulary. For example, while Lucy Mackenzie would adapt and exploit the potential for narrative and biographic self-portraiture in the genre, she would ultimately stay within the confines of a tightly controlled technique. Mangold, on the other hand, took it as an opportunity to cut loose with her materials, getting past the kind of finickiness which is trompe l'oeil's major stumbling block by the very painterliness of the work. She allows herself a high degree of freedom in the landscapes framed by the highly finished tapes. Tapes which are themselves full of painterly intrigue. The complex layering of colour and transparency as the cream of the tape interacts with the hue of the paint below, their edges standing out in relief, their surfaces almost powdered on. There's considerable time and care put into applying the illusion of something designed to be easily peeled off and thrown away. In many ways, masking tape was the invisible tool which had made hard-edge minimalist painting possible. But Mangold would find a great deal of mileage in the material itself, as would other tricky artists like Pierre Baraglio, or her sometime neighbour, Robert Ryman. Both Mangold and Ryman engage in a similar play between internal logic and formal variation. Yet Ryman dispenses completely with anything pictorial, anything like an external subject matter. Unlike Mangold, he uses actual tape along with other functional devices like fasteners and bolts as part of the pared-back utilitarian language of the work. It's a literal inversion of trompe l'oeil illusionism, the work entirely composed of flat painted surfaces and the bits and pieces needed to attach them to the wall. The painter's role here becomes a matter of alternatively solving and complicating the problems involved in all of this. In pieces like Philadelphia Prototype, sheets of vinyl are stuck to the wall using nothing but acrylic paint. When the strips of adhesive tape used to hold them in place during the painting are removed, they are left surrounded by a series of unpainted tabs, exposing a layer of slightly glossier emulsion below. Painterly values like delicacy, reflectivity, touch are all still crucial. Yet the look and feel of the work is also determined by outside influences, like the white of the wall or the light from a nearby window. Limond spreads out of the frame, questioning the extension of the art to the room around it. Pieces like Philadelphia Prototype implicitly raise the issue of where the work begins and ends. But Mangold asks where the picture begins and ends within a work, questioning how we designate pictorial information as being essential or incidental by its relation to the four walls which surround it. Just as she'd spend the first few years of her life as a mature artist circling the skirting boards of her home, Mangold's entire career has, in many ways, been a sustained survey of the picture's edge. The picture frame both establishes and questions what is or is not suitable material for our attention. It's also partly where Mangold's distinct, if ambivalent feminism comes in. Appeals to Mangold's place in feminist discourse, which were mostly established by male critics writing at the time of her floor paintings, tend to focus on her domesticity, that she paints from the point of view of a housewife stuck indoors. But this misses the countless ways in which she attends to the overlooked, to things conventionally excluded from being the main event of a picture. Her masking tape paintings particularly question the scale of the landscapes and the various levels of looking involved in perceiving and depicting them, that hidden labour in making them. The frame, the periphery, the seemingly insignificant or incidental, all of these are extended and enlarged, rebalancing the visual hierarchies of the genre, just as they also readdress the role of the maker and the kind of attention requested of the viewer. Even their size is significant. They are large paintings made at a heroic scale, but not in a heroic manner. It's something we also see in Carol Rode's aerial perspective landscapes. It's as if we're looking down on a tabletop play world. Conventional visual hierarchies are evened out under a flattened perspective. A perspective which doesn't privilege this or that aspect of the terrain or the picture, the near or the far, the big or the small, the natural or the human. The other artists in Solitaire, Lee, Lozano, Joan Semmel, also shift traditional notions of perspective and viewpoint, using pictorial composition and recomposition as implicitly feminist tools. Yet their work is fundamentally about the gendered body, something conspicuous by its absence in Mangold's painting. Of course, there are several reasons why the body dominates narratives of feminist art in the 1970s, but painters like Mangold show the story to go deeper and wider in its subjects and forms, showing that gendered attention, whether in the form of normative approaches to image structure or to the relationship between maker, subject and viewer, can be just as significant as explicitly gendered subjects themselves. That it's about how you look as much as who's doing the looking. In this, Mangold also brings to mind the work of Pauline Oliveros, an early pioneer of electronic music whose deep listening projects, theories and teaching methods synthesize elements of meditation, martial arts and feminist sociology. In 1953, Oliveros's mother sent her an Ampex tape machine from Sears. Recalling her fascination with the soundscapes of her rural childhood, she set the microphone up at her apartment window and hit record. In her 1977 essay, Software for People, Oliveros wrote of how field recording and electronic process music allowed her to expand her sonic attention, to find an attention that was diffuse, open and non-judgmental, as opposed to focused, selective attention, which is narrow, clear, and discriminatory, but limited in capacity. Importantly, she also discovered that it was possible to utilize both methods of attention simultaneously. There's something of the same simultaneity at play in Mangold's roving attention, which can embrace both the landscape and the tiny incidental details of her drawing and painting materials, the window and the workspace. It's there also in her love of the sample of small portions of larger totalities, whether that's sections of floors and rulers or excerpts of depicted landscapes. Each stresses its own partiality, its own limits, and therefore, in a way, exceeds those limits. In Exact and Diminishing, she tests the true-to-life scale of the ruler at the canvas edge, with the receding but equally true scale of the ruler squished by the diminishing perspective. Both are internally consistent, yet diametrically opposed forms of realism. As with the frames, rulers measure limits and boundaries. They tell us where things begin and end, and yet with images like this, such limits are both clearly delineated and ultimately overcome. Her husband, Robert Mangold, wrote perceptively that Sylvia paints what is right in front of her. Sylvia is very selective in what she paints. Those two sentences seem contradictory, but I think they're correct. Her paintings manage to be simultaneously non-judgmental and discriminatory, narrow and diffuse, open and clear. As Oliveros put it in Software for People, good attentional flexibility is essential for participation in music, no matter what one's role is. Mangold shows that this is equally true of painters and viewers. But getting away from the perceptual philosophizing, the taped paintings also carry a series of more lived-in associations. They might look like watercolours taped onto drawing boards, but they also look like pictures pinned to the wall or stuck to the fridge, postcards or snaps. They're a bit like the watercolours Peter Schmidt painted for Brian Eno's Before and After Science album. Daydreamy, peaceful, clean. The changing background colours suggest the different rooms of a house. It's as if the window frames have been masked off during decorating. There's the peculiar sense of both stasis and activity that comes with moving into a new place. A moment of pause and preparation, action and inertia. It's a feeling that's also there in what kinds of floors she paints. Sometimes they feel institutional, like the lino in waiting rooms, schools and hospitals. At other times, like new flooring in an empty house, waiting for the furniture to arrive. Like Gustav Caillebott's Floor Scrapers, they're about stripping things back to start afresh, clearing things away to focus on surfaces and spaces. Surfaces and spaces which expand under our attention, till the room becomes a field to cultivate, a planet to terraform. The first two phases of Mangold's career are about preparation, about forever getting things ready. With her long stares at the floor, the constant overtures of her masking tapes, she suggests that we spend most of our lives dreaming them away, forever making and changing plans or putting things off indefinitely. And yet, they're equally about getting lost in the present, getting caught up in whatever's in front of us, whatever catches our eye. Just like Caillebott, she's interested in how we shift our focus, whether that's in art or in life. Unhurried and methodical, Mangold's oeuvre can be divided up into three distinct bodies of work, each lasting between 15 and 30 years. It's a glacial pace that recalls Tony Conrad's Yellow movies. Inspired by the silhouettes left on walls by pieces of furniture, Conrad saw them as a form of long process filmmaking, the idea being that if a person stood in front of the white emulsion long enough, their image would be exposed onto the slowly yellowing paint. An artist fascinated by duration, Conrad was also an early pioneer of drone music. He said he wanted to end composing, to get rid of it. Ideas that were part of Rauschenberg's white paintings in the 1950s were still clearly circulating in the 1970s, particularly the absent but implied body, whether that of the artist herself or the viewer who stands in her shoes. Because for all that Mangold refuses to paint the figure, there's always an implicit sense of both a very present looker and of her own identity or persona, of her own position as the picker and chooser, the pictorial selector and eliminator, the composer. The trace of a person or personality behind the assemblage, which was always part of the quadlibre, remains imprinted in Mangold's pictures, no matter how apparently minimal or anonymous. As discreet as she's been over the years, she's inevitably left a faint picture of herself. Mangold's concerns have been startlingly consistent since the 1960s. Always there's a hyper-awareness of what's in and outside of the frame, the detail and the larger structure, the present and absent artist, the present moment, and the surrounding continuum of time. From the late 1980s onwards, the tree paintings would again pull all of these preoccupations into play, while being as radically different in approach as any of her past phases. Still concerned with cycles and processes, they'd also bring her bracingly into the present moment, stepping fully out into the world. But she didn't step out all at once. As always, it was a gradual progression. For one thing, it was only after a while that the masking tapes came off, but becoming less and less prominent, eventually they were only there as a thin relief around the edge of the painting before disappearing altogether. The taped borders were a bit like a set of training wheels or stabilizers that Alberto Giacometti could never quite bring himself to work without, even in the rare landscape painting. Whatever the subject, Giacometti nearly always painted a rough border within the picture, a wavering frame that cordoned off the subject as an area of study, while alluding to its compromised state as a mere picture of the subject. The borders were a safety structure of sorts, the visual equivalent of holding up his hands and saying he tried. Likewise, for Mangold to take the tapes off was to risk getting a little too close to the subject, to lose her conceptual distance, to be fully exposed as a painterly performer. Obvious ancestors to the tree paintings include modernist heavyweights like Mondrian, but also Cézanne, a formative influence. But while Cézanne's overall project is crucial for her, the resulting paintings are in some ways closer to Giacometti. She paints the tree's portrait in the same way he paints his sitters, face on, centered, almost deadpan. And she's also much more like the constantly overpainting and adjusting Giacometti than the often hesitant, sparingly provisional Cézanne. But at the same time, she's also constantly striving to maintain a lightness, preventing things from getting turgid, mired. Like both artists, Mangold is trying to get at nature without copying it slavishly and without copying existing painterly conventions. But of course, they also have to work as paintings. Whether she's getting too specific, too preoccupied with the tree, at the expense of what's happening on the canvas in front of her, she reminds herself she's supposed to be making a painting, not a picture. And it's a challenging balancing act, requiring all of her attentional flexibility. The paintings have to reconcile our implied position on the ground with our actual position in front of the canvas. In trying to recreate the awareness of the peripheral, the tangible sensation of the larger structure which we have in real vision, she has to, in a sense, paint what isn't there, adjusting the image to suggest tensions and balances which lie beyond the picture's edge. As always, cropping and portioning are essential. Mangold varies the framing into three main groups: the top half of the tree, a high midpoint with a confusion of branches and foliage, and a close-up with leaves filling the canvas. All of which may seem relatively straightforward, traditional even, but they're all pretty unique for observational landscape painting, and they each come with their own challenges. The treetops aren't painted in extreme perspective as if seen from the ground, but they do generate the feeling of looking upward. Mangold said that she wants them to whoosh up, with the viewer projecting themselves like a small bird or a flying insect. They have to negotiate this buoyancy with a sense of weight and gravity, just as they also have to fill the frame without clogging it up. Something that the mid-level views push even further, while the extreme close-ups have to totally adapt the approach to mark making and handling if they're to avoid falling into fussy illustration or broad generalization. Mangold has spent a lifetime thinking about the picture's edge, but the tree paintings show her more alert than ever to what's happening moment to moment within those edges. There's an ebb and flow of attention as a mark or a hue changes its role or function across the image. In the same way that tape loops phase shift, with the listener's ear flexing from one focus to the other, a shadow here becomes a recession there. A gathered ridge of white paint defines both the edge of a branch and the light poking through. Sometimes this morphs into the same logic-defying double marking that we see in Cézanne. Branches and brushstrokes changing identity from moment to moment as the painter's attention flits between light and form, front and back, world and picture. Such marks betray the eye and the hand in a mild panic, trying to keep up with what's happening, grappling to pin it down. In the end, the whole coheres, but the parts dissolve, a common symptom of intensive observational painting. For both Mangold and Cézanne, trees are painterly paradox incarnate, whole yet atomized, seen in the moment but also in essence, entirely understood yet totally baffling, alien. Each artist's approach to the world in front of them is a radical reassessment of what it means to be a composer and or a perceiver, a visual processor or a synthesizer. Yet, Mangold doesn't do anything easily recognizable as modern or even postmodern. They're entirely earnest in approach. Only at the picture's edge, the place where her earnestness hits a wall, can we faintly see once again her qualified conceptualism, her minimalism. The results may seem straightforward, but they add up to something inquiring, committed, and open. Something strangely timeless. In 1967, Robert Motherwell saw a small canvas leaning against a larger one in the corner of his studio. He thought the proportion was beautiful, so he grabbed a stick of charcoal and outlined the smaller painting on the bigger one. He thought it looked like a door. So he turned it upside down, and it becomes a window. The happy accident kick-started what became known as his Open series, a project which would occupy him for the rest of his life. Like Mangold, Motherwell was alive to the space and the materials around him. Open number 97, the Spanish house, was inspired by a photograph of a building in the town of Cadac, which he'd had pinned to his studio wall for several years. Again and again, observation, openness, and chance find their way back into minimal abstraction, along with the knives and forks and the Spanish houses, the stuff of the world. Mangold has an innate feeling for scale and proportion equal to Motherwell's. But she complicates the idea of proportion, of fitting things within things, by making those things complex natural forms painted from observation, like trees. Mangold's simple setup, paint the tree, fill the picture with the tree, is made complex in the doing, in having to paint from life, in having to be receptive and reactive to a huge range of sensory input, while maintaining her own aesthetic sensibilities, painting what's in front of her, being highly selective in what she paints. Early in her career, Paulina Liveros was criticised in the music press for apparently failing to compose her pieces. Critics never considered that she might be part of a radical reassessment of what it might mean to compose at all, that it might mean being more of an initiator, a reactor, an improviser, or a listener. As she explained, the design of how the electronic pieces would come into existence was what I mapped, not the content at all. It was a kind of performance architecture, using tape machines and understanding certain operations in the circuitry which was non-linear. I didn't have time to think about it in rational terms, but I had to act in the moment. It's in the tree paintings that Mangold is most alive to what's happening within her performance architecture. They show that there's still untapped potential in observational painting's intense looking, that it's weirdly close to improvisation, that it can still be a place of paradox and opposition, Mangold's home territory. An artist who made highly finished paintings about things left unfinished, who paints whatever's in front of her, but is also highly selective in what she paints. Mangold shows that strategy isn't cold and painting from nature isn't romantic. To work within minimal abstraction isn't necessarily to be minimal or abstract, and that nothing transcends its limitations more than that which accepts and begins from those limitations. The series of paradoxes she sets up are all the more powerful, as it's all done so discreetly.